Great. So we'll start with sealing as a service. I want to talk about sealing as a service overall by setting background and providing some context around Filecoin Sealing as a whole. Talk about the architecture for sealing as a service. Talk about the market that we've started to create, and then we'll go into the roadmap as well. So just to give an overview of what the sealing process looks like, Magic went into this in much more detail in the other room earlier, but basically it's a computationally expensive process that's very resource intensive. A lot of the information that gets pushed through is sequential, and so it requires a lot of compute resources to complete the sealing process. Each SP that wants to onboard data to the network and wants to seal sectors needs to seal those sectors first, whether the sector has data or not. That's the only way that they can onboard data to the network. And so you're looking at a process that takes around 4.5 hours. PC1 is 3 hours, PC2 is 30 minutes, C2 is another hour, and each one is tied directly together. So the output of PC1 is the input of PC2, and it's just a very complex process. So what does that mean for hardware costs? For a storage provider that wants to join the network, Angelo actually did a really good job of basically tiering SPs by size and looking at what their hardware CapEx would be to join the network. And we're looking at between $25,000 for the smallest SPs to $10 million for the largest SPs. So if you look at those numbers and you look at the SPs that have joined the network so far, we found that there's actually $2.5 billion worth of hardware locked in the network today. And a lot of that hardware is coming from some of our main SPs, the 1 to 10 PIB range and the 10 to 50 PIB range, that have each put in over $1 billion per year in hardware just to join the network. So if you look at, that's total hardware costs. If you look at the sealing CapEx, you're actually looking at a pretty large percent that's dedicated to sealing. And so it's actually very difficult and expensive to join the network. It's difficult to access these compute resources. And so right now, if you look at the way that Filecoin is structured as a whole across the network, each SP that wants to join the network has to do both the compute and the storage. So it's just a very high barrier to entry right now. So that sort of sets the stage for how expensive it can be to join the network. If we look at sealing as a service, we're looking at the network as a whole, and we see that it is very difficult for SPs that are currently in the network to increase their sealing rate. And it's difficult for SPs that have spare compute resources to make use of those spare compute resources. It's also difficult to onboard to the network because you need to do both the compute and the storage. So the mission of sealing as a service is to accelerate the onboarding of data to the network by separating compute from storage and ultimately creating a two-sided marketplace for Filecoin compute. The first step of that was to make sure that we could do sealing as a service natively within Lotus. And so we worked with the Lotus team to develop sealing APIs and really wanted to create a generic interface that external sealing services could plug into. So these new APIs will, for the first time, allow for the decoupling of compute from storage, and this would allow for sealing as a service providers and Snark as a service providers to plug into the network. So basically, PC1 and PC2 can now be outsourced to an external sealing service. If you want to do both PC1, PC2, and C1 and C2, you can have a sealing service that does all four of those processes. If you wanted to just outsource the C2, which is the last part that does the Snark computation, you could have a Snark as a service to do that for you. So since these APIs have just been implemented into Lotus, we're now looking at the next step of the process, which is how do we integrate with these APIs, and how do we allow for external sealing services to plug in. We have multiple teams that are working on this right now that have worked on the design. Supranational has been really helpful working on the design and providing information on the design. There's actually a GitHub discussion where this is being looked at right now, and we came to a conclusion of a certain type of APIs that will be able to be optimal for sealing services to plug into the network. Greater Heat is working on different sealing as a services as well. And then Philmine is actually currently the main driver of the sealing software that's going to be ultimately integrated with Lotus. We want to have multiple teams working on this and essentially have multiple sealing as a service providers that are able to plug into Lotus. The next step here, after we've actually completed the integration and we see that it's up and running, is to create a sealing as a service working group that'll bring together the different parts of the ecosystem. So you have pilot program participants, which are going to be the actual SPs that are ingesting the compute. You're going to have sealing as a service providers that can be either SPs with spare compute resources or completely separate companies like Aligned that would be able to provide a sealing as a service and plug in externally. And then we want to keep the Lotus team involved because we're definitely going to run into certain issues or run into certain changes that need to be made to these new APIs. Things are going to break. And so we want to bring everyone into the same room together to work together on optimizing sealing as a service prior to scaling. And the last thing is we just want to make sure that the entire network is aware of the work that's going on here. So we're working on creating a public website that's going to track work, and ultimately you'll be able to see all of the different players that are involved in sealing as a service. So as far as the sealing as a service market, we kind of touched on this earlier, but there's basically different types of customer profiles that would be most benefited from this. You're looking at SPs that want to increase their sealing rate that aren't able to currently have access to compute, or they don't have the funds to compute. They have difficulties accessing that hardware. That's one. And then you have SPs that actually have spare compute resources. They have an abundance of compute that want to actually sell that to SPs that are looking for compute resources. And then the third one is actually brand new types of customer profiles that didn't used to exist. So you're looking at new SPs that for the first time can actually join the network without having any compute resources. These SPs would be able to just do the storing for the first time. And then you have, on the opposite side, external sealing services that can contribute to the network without actually storing any data themselves. So you're basically able to unlock marketplace for compute for SPs that are currently in the ecosystem, but you're also able to create new types of storage providers or sealing providers that are just doing the sealing or just doing the storing. So we did a ton of research to make sure that this was something that people would be interested in, and we've got some really good feedback. We started taking into account where people are at with their sealing rates and where people are looking at going. And these are some examples of different SPs that have submitted where there's a differential in terms of the compute resources that they currently have. And this is measured in TIBs. So you're really looking at petabytes that are going to be unlocked with a sealing as a service, barring no issues to technical difficulties or issues to cost. If everything worked as expected, you would be unlocking PIBs of compute power per day. And we currently have over 50 sealing as a service users and sealing as a service providers that are interested in using a service like this. So as we mentioned, there's also new players that can come and join the Filecoin network as far as large sealing as a service providers that weren't able to join the network before. And if we're able to bring those types of sealing as a service providers to the network, you're looking at a big jump in the amount of compute that's unlocked for the network. We have some companies that are talking about adding 10,000 TIPS per day in compute power. These are not SPs that have a differential in terms of compute with spare compute resources. These are specialized companies that are interested in joining the network to just contribute compute. And then you also have all of the tons of SPs that would be able to join the network by just storing. And there's also some companies like Snarkify that are interested in providing a Snark as a service. Similar to the Ethereum and Chia miners, these are miners that have an excess amount of GPUs, and a Snark as a service or a window post as a service, this would be something that would be enabled through these new sealing as a service capabilities. So as far as a roadmap goes, the first step is making sure that we're all aligned on the design of the APIs. And we were able to do that. Lotus was able to implement these new APIs. And the second step is making that integration, completing that integration and making sure that we're able to build a Sealing as a Service software that people are gonna wanna use that doesn't break. We're currently in the second step right now, and we have a few teams that are working on that integration. We wanna test that with various teams in the ecosystem and really start a pilot. We've also created a Sealing as a Service waitlist so that once the pilot is complete, we're able to open it up to the public and multiple Sealing as a Service users and providers can join the network. And really, once everything is ready to go and we feel comfortable with the service as it stands, it's about scaling. So you have a pilot program with a few storage providers and a few Sealing as a Service providers, and then you have a GA that's where it's available to the broader public, and then you have ultimately a marketplace where we want to essentially automate some of the matchmaking that's going to happen between the users and the providers. So if you're interested, please scan that QR code. And we already have a ton of people that are interested in becoming users or providers. This is basically a wait list to let us know if you would be interested in being both or one or the other. And then we'll be emailing you and letting you know of any future business opportunities over the next few months. Any questions on Sealing as a Service? No questions. All made sense. Okay. This is good. So we don't have a ton of time, so I'll just go over this pretty quickly. The Decentralized Storage Alliance is something that was announced a couple of days ago. Really happy about bringing together some big ecosystem partners. And so we'll just do a quick overview of what the Alliance is, what we're trying to do, what the process was like for forming the entity, and the timeline for joining and for adding new working groups. So similar to Sealing as a Service, there's just a ton of work that still needs to be done to make it easier to onboard to the network. And the barrier to entry for storage providers still remains super high. So what the Decentralized Storage Alliance does is it creates a place where different ecosystem partners can come together, partners that didn't necessarily have a place to create new working groups. And the goal here is to accelerate the adoption of decentralized storage technologies by enterprises. So the mission, increase enterprise adoption of decentralized storage technologies, Filecoin, IPFS, libp2p, and ultimately have this be part of their day-to-day business operations. What are the core drivers? We want to create standard specifications. We really want to make sure that we're creating tangible, useful deliverables, because I think that there have been some alliances in the past that have lost their sort of way and don't create a ton of value for the ecosystems that they're part of. And we want to make sure that we're creating a ton of value for storage providers, for ecosystem partners, for anyone that would be interested in joining the network. So we want to accelerate the adoption of decentralized storage technologies among enterprises. We want to create educational materials, technical resources, best practices. We want to enable SIs to understand the technology and to get embedded into what it is to be a Filecoin miner. And we also want to have them enable them to build services on top as well. We want to ease the onboarding of storage providers to the network, and ultimately this will all be done through the creation of working groups that will specialize in solving decentralized storage technology issues. So there's a few key stakeholders here. You have enterprises, hardware vendors, storage providers, system integrators, and technology providers, and all of them are interested in joining this type of alliance for different reasons. Enterprises will have a much better understanding of the technology and will benefit from the different improvements that will come that are focused on allowing them to use that technology for their businesses. Hardware vendors will have access to a massive market in terms of the Filecoin network, and will be able to influence reference specifications that come out of the alliance. Storage providers will be able to join and provide input on their needs and ways of expanding their operation. system integrators we just touched on that will be able to understand the technology and build services on top of the technology, and then the technology providers themselves will be able to see the long-term growth of their industry. It was not easy to do this in a short amount of time, so we definitely had some really important and helpful partners in the space. Jesmer Updegrove was a law firm that has done over 200 of these alliances before that we could ask certain questions to. Virtual actually was an outsourced management company that worked with the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. We reached out to people from the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance and used them as advisors. Us as Protocol Labs and Filecoin Foundation also had advisors that were interested in helping us get this off the ground. And then we used OpenState, basically internal agency, to create the website and the brand. OpenState did an amazing job. We, from scratch, just created a brand. If you see, these are decentralized nodes in the shape of an S. So this is super aligned with what we're trying to do here. The logo, Decentralized Storage Alliance, with that decentralized nodes in the shape of an S. And then we actually have a website that's off the ground now. If you go to dsalliance.io, you'll be able to visit that. It has more information about the alliance and just information about the working groups that exist. It took a while to actually get people on board. So we did a ton of outreach. We tried to make sure that people understood the mission, that we had a clear path to what types of working groups these first members would be interested in forming. And we got some pretty big names on board. So besides Protocol Labs and Filecoin Foundation, we have AMD, Seagate, and EY. We actually, post-launch and a little bit pre-launch, got some interesting interest from some other really big players in the space that will be joining in a second batch relatively soon. And we also have a bi-weekly working group, the Enterprise Architecture Working Group, that's already running, where we're working on a reference architecture for the broader community, and this involves AMD, Seagate, Protocol Labs, and some external partners that are experts in the proofs and the sealing process. As far as the timeline goes, we are currently in this middle Phil-Lisbon state where we just were able to announce the alliance to the broader community. Saw some really good press. Business Wire picked it up, Yahoo Finance picked it up, CoinDesk, Cointelegraph. So just really good to see this kind of validation of what we're doing here, and the interest that we get from really big Web2 companies helps us build kind of credence to Web3, and we're going to see a lot more of this in the future. We're going to have a second batch of community members that get added over the next 2 months, and then ultimately in 2023, we want to make sure that we are creating new working groups with these new members. And we want to have a ton of pillars that function inside of the Alliance for any way that people want to advance decentralized storage technologies among enterprises to help the ecosystem grow. If you're interested in joining, please scan this QR code and then visit the website, dsalliance.io. Any questions on this? We're good? We're good. One question.
What are some of the initiatives the Decentralized Storage Alliance partners are trying to work on and partner up with?
Yeah, so the one that we started with right now is dedicated to creating a reference architecture that is going to be available to the broader community. We don't really have really good reference architecture that people can use right now. And so we have AMD and Seagate that are coming, and they're actually building a community lab. So they're testing things on the fly. They're able to come back with information on how those tests are running. An example is we had someone from AMD, they're coming out with FPGAs, new FPGAs. Are these going to be better than the GPUs that currently exist? We're not sure. They can run those tests, come back, and see how that would plug into what Seagate's building. And then we also have some interest from future partners that have specific working groups. I don't think I can talk about it just yet, but there's going to be other tracks that are specific to how would this benefit a consulting firm? How would this benefit a large hardware vendor? How would this benefit a future partner that is in the cloud, for example? So there's lots of different ways that we can go about it, and these different working groups are going to be specific to the members of those working groups, and they'll all be focused on decentralized storage technology. Thank you.